Welcome to Steady Badge's Stories. I'm glad you found your way here today. If this one pulls at something in you, and I think it will, hit like, subscribe if you haven't already, and leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. I love knowing how far these stories travel, from Newfoundland out to the Okanagan and everywhere in between. What I'm about to tell you happened inside a veterans' neurological center in Ottawa. It's about a man the system had already decided was gone, a doctor who needed him to stay that way, and a nurse in bright blue scrubs who had spent 6 years trying to forget a name she was about to hear again. That name would undo everything Dr. Preston Cahill had spent 6 months building, and it would give a man back his voice when every expert in that building had declared there was nothing left to save. Nobody at the Rideau Veterans Neurological Center wanted to fight for the man in room 7. The attending neurologist had written him off by the end of his first week. The rehabilitation coordinator called his file resource intensive with negligible prognosis. The ward nurses had stopped speaking to him directly by month 3. Not out of cruelty exactly, but out of the quiet understanding that conversation required someone on the other end. According to every clinical note signed by Dr. Preston Cahill, there was no one home inside Corporal First Class Joel Tanner. Joel had been a sniper with the Royal Canadian Regiment, 2 tours in Afghanistan, 1 in Mali under Operation Presence, before an IED on a red dirt road outside Kadal took everything from him in 4 seconds. The blast left him with a severe traumatic brain injury, collapsed in a field hospital, airlifted twice, operated on 3 times. By the time he arrived at Rideau, the file used the phrase vegetative state with no meaningful cortical response. A decorated soldier, 38 years old, reduced to a paragraph no one had time to finish reading. Simone Ouellet noticed his left eye on her 3rd shift. She was the day nurse assigned to room 7, a quiet woman in cobalt blue scrubs that looked 1 size too large on her lean frame. Her dark hair was pinned back in a knot that had started the morning neat and was already losing the argument by noon. She had gray eyes that stayed low, a habit built in environments where direct eye contact with the wrong person cost more than it was worth. She had been at Rideau 14 months. Nobody on the ward knew much about her before that. She had come from a position with a military hospital in Petawawa, and before Petawawa her employment record showed gaps that nobody had thought to question. The eye moved when she spoke. Not dramatically. Not in any way that a doctor scanning monitors for 3 minutes at the foot of a bed would catch. But Simone was not scanning. She was adjusting the angle of the window blind, talking quietly to Joel the way she talked to all her patients. Not performing optimism, just maintaining the basic courtesy that someone in a bed deserved, and his left eye tracked the movement of her hand. She stopped. She moved her hand again slowly, the eye followed. She said nothing to Dr. Cahill that morning. She had learned, in 14 months at Rideau, that Cahill did not receive information. He received confirmation of what he had already decided. He was 61 years old and carried the bearing of a man who had been the smartest person in every room he'd entered for the last 3 decades and had quietly stopped checking whether this was still true. He ran the neurology unit with precise authority and a zero-tolerance policy for what he called sentimental interpretation of ambiguous data. Simone spent 4 days documenting what she observed, left eye tracking, pupils narrowing toward sound when the name Tanner was spoken. A shift in respiratory rhythm, shallow, then deeper, when the radio at the nurse's station played anything with a guitar in it. On the 5th day, she brought her notes to morning rounds. Cahill glanced at the chart and handed it back. Reflex responses, he said. Not volitional, his brainstem is intact, that doesn't constitute awareness. His pupils respond differentially to his name versus ambient noise, Simone said. That's cortical processing, not brainstem. The room went quiet in the way rooms do when someone says the one true thing no one wanted said aloud. Cahill looked at her the way men like him had looked at nurses like her for 100 years, a look that had not changed much despite everything, the look that said you work here and I decide here, and those are not the same thing. I'll make a note that nursing staff have raised concerns, he said. He made no note. The incident that changed everything happened on a Wednesday afternoon in November. Simone was repositioning Joel's pillow when he made a sound. Not a word, not even a full syllable exactly. A rasp, like something had tried to work its way up and run out of room halfway. She leaned closer without thinking about whether she was supposed to. He made the sound again. 2 syllables, broken. A vowel dragging the consonant behind it like something heavy. Corby. Simone went completely still. Corby was not a name, not a word any civilian in the building would recognize. It was a call sign issued to one person, used on exactly 3 operations, attached to a military record that had been classified for 6 years. The last time anyone had spoken that name aloud, Simone had been dangling from a rescue hoist over a dust storm in the Sahel with 2 broken fingers, and a wounded soldier who kept telling her he was fine when he manifestly was not. She straightened slowly. She checked his face. His left eye was fixed on hers. She swallowed once, then she said very quietly, "Tangent." His call sign, the one from the Molly extraction. Joel Tanner's eye filled. Simone pressed her hands flat against the side rail of his bed to keep them from shaking. She had spent 6 years not thinking about Molly. 6 years rebuilding a version of herself that wore blue scrubs, kept her head down, and did good quiet work in a ward that needed good quiet people. She had not spoken her old name aloud in all that time. She had not expected to hear it from the mouth of a man who had been declared vegetative for 6 months. "I see you," she said, low enough that no one outside the door could catch it. "I know you're in there." He blinked once, deliberate, clear. She brought the documentation to Cahill the following morning. 7 days of blood pressure irregularities she had flagged and never received a response to. Pupillary data, eye tracking, the sound Joel had made. She described it as possible vocalization with apparent communicative intent. She did not mention what he had said. She was not ready to explain how she knew what it meant. Cahill read the first page. "You've been very thorough," he said, in the tone people use when thoroughness is not a compliment. "He's responding," Simone said. "I believe there's a compressive lesion the initial imaging missed. He needs a repeat MRI with a neurologist who isn't anchored to the original prognosis." Cahill closed the folder. "I'll be documenting this conversation as an example of overreach. I'd encourage you to consider what that means for your position here." Simone kept her face neutral. "I'd encourage you to consider what it means for his." He suspended her from Joel's case before noon. That afternoon, Joel's blood pressure crashed. The nurse covering the room caught it late. By the time the monitor alarmed, Joel's heart rate had dropped to 41, and his skin had gone the gray-white of old concrete. Simone heard the code call from the hallway, recognized the room number, and walked back through the door before anyone had time to tell her she wasn't supposed to be there. She assessed him in 4 seconds, looked at the pillow. His chin was tilted back, neck extended, airway subtly compromised, blood pressure in freefall. Autonomic collapse triggered by cervical irritation. Exactly what she had flagged. Exactly what nobody had acted on. She repositioned his neck without asking permission. "Get atropine," she said. The covering nurse looked at Cahill, who had appeared in the doorway. Simone said it again, not louder but differently, the way she had learned to give directions when rotor wash was so loud you couldn't shout, and the only way to be heard was to mean it more precisely. 0.5 milligrams of E now. They gave it. Joel's heart rate climbed, 41, 47, 54. Cahill stood in the doorway with his arms crossed. Vagal response: "This doesn't change the prognosis. It changes the fact that he nearly died because his neck was extended for 40 minutes, Simone said. Again. She called the neurosurgery fellow herself. Then rapid response. Then she requested an emergency MRI and listed, in clinical language that left no room for interpretation, every symptom she had documented, every flagged note that had gone unanswered, every positioning incident that had coincided with cardiovascular instability. When the imaging came back, the neurosurgery fellow, Dr. Anaya Mehta, stood in front of the screen for a long time without speaking. There was a compressive lesion at C4, small, old enough to be chronic, new enough to be dynamic, shifting with position, pressing on the cord at angles the original scan, taken in a different hospital under emergency conditions, had never captured. Mehta looked at Simone. "How long have you been tracking his positioning responses?" "Since my 3rd shift," Simone said, 14 months ago. Mehta looked at the file, then at Cahill. "Why wasn't this re-imaged?" Cahill said there was no clinical indication. Mehta held up Simone's documentation. There were 7 days of documented indication. Cahill's expression did not shift, nursing observations. "Yes," Mehta said, "accurate ones." She ordered the decompression surgery for the following morning. Cahill suspended Simone before the end of the shift, not from Joel's case this time, from the unit entirely. A formal suspension's pending review, citing insubordination, clinical overreach, and a pattern of behavior inconsistent with collaborative care. Simone was escorted to the locker room and told to leave the building. She left. She sat in her car in the parking structure for 11 minutes. The November outside was the kind of Ottawa cold that doesn't fall so much as press down, hard and gray, getting into the bones before you've finished buttoning your coat. She put her hands on the steering wheel and breathed the way she had learned to breathe in a cargo hold at 10,000 feet, with someone else's blood drying on her gloves. 4 counts in, 4 hold, 4 out. She had done harder things than this. The harder things were the problem. She went back inside. Not with any announcement. She walked through the side entrance, took the stairs, and was at Joel's bedside before anyone in administration had processed that she had been escorted out. "Tangent," she said quietly. "They found the compression. Surgery is tomorrow morning. You have a chance." His left eye tracked one blink. She picked up the letterboard she had left beside his bed and guided his eye across the surface. It took time. His focus drifted. She waited. She had learned, in the field, that the only productive response to waiting was more waiting, done patiently enough that the other person believed you had nowhere else to be. He found the letters. Shane. Simone closed her eyes for a moment. Shane Beaumont, Corporal, Signals Corps. The youngest person in the Cadal extraction. The one Simone had reached first and stayed with longest and ultimately been pulled away from to reach another casualty while he was still conscious, still talking, still looking at her with eyes that said don't go and a mouth that said I'm fine, go, I'm fine. She had never known what he said after she left. She had only known that he died in the field hospital 4 hours later, and she was not there, and that this had been sitting in her chest like ballast ever since the day she signed her release papers. Was he? She started. Joel's eye moved before she finished. He spelled it slowly, Toldme. Told me. She steadied the board and waited. Shesavedhi. She saved him first. The ward sounds continued outside the room. A phone rang at the nurse's station. A door opened somewhere down the hall. Simone stood at the side of a hospital bed in Ottawa in November and felt something she had been carrying for 6 years begin, very slowly, to come apart at the seams. That's not, she started. I wasn't there when he... Joel blinked once, hard. THATSW. She understood. She had reached Shane first. She had stabilized him enough that he survived until the medics arrived. What happened after she left was not abandonment. It was the natural order of a mass casualty event with not enough hands. Shane had known that. Shane had apparently told Joel that before he died, in the way soldiers tell each other the true things when they know time is running out. Simone sat down in the chair beside the bed. She did not cry. She pressed her palms flat on her thighs and breathed until the tremor in her hands stopped. Then she looked at Joel Tanner, at the man who had been in this room for 6 months, while the people responsible for his care had already moved on without him, and she said, "Okay, then we both keep going." One blink. The Canadian Armed Forces liaison arrived at 0630 the following morning. Major Isabelle Rousseau walked through the front entrance of Rideau, with a legal representative from DND and a folder thick enough to stop a door with. Beside her was a man Simone recognized before he turned around. Colonel Rémy Thibodeau, her last commanding officer before she left the forces, the man who had countersigned her release papers and told her, with the brevity of someone who had given this speech before, that leaving the uniform was not the same as losing the mission. He had apparently come to make that point in person. He found her at the nurse's station, still in blue scrubs, still technically suspended, still there. "Uwellet," he said. "Sir." He looked at the scrubs, the ID badge, the circles under her eyes. "You look exactly the same," he said, which was not true, and they both knew it. "So do you," she said back, which was also not true. It was the elliptical shorthand of people who had been in the same smoke and had agreed not to talk about it directly. Cahill appeared from the corridor with the hospital administrator, Gilles Fontaine, at his shoulder. Fontaine was the kind of administrator who had never been in a room with a military officer and was demonstrating this by smiling at the wrong moments. Cahill had composed himself into something approximating control. "Colonel," he said, "I understand there's been some miscommunication about the nursing staff situation." Thibodeau looked at him without warmth. "I understand there's been a compressive lesion missed for 6 months while the treating physician documented the patient as non-responsive. DND has questions about the quality of care." Fontaine's smile flickered. Rousseau opened the folder. Inside were the results of a DND requested records review, gaps in medication logs, sedation administered during overnight hours with no corresponding clinical notes, and a research consent document bearing Joel's signature on a date when Joel could not have held a pen. Simone had not known about the consent form. She found out the same moment Cahill did. His face, when Rousseau placed the document on the counter, said everything. Not outrage, not confusion. The specific stillness of a man who has been caught and is rapidly calculating whether there is still a way out. "That signature is dated November 4th, Rousseau said. "You documented Mr. Tanner as being in a vegetative state on November 4th. Signatures can be obtained through. From someone with no volitional response?" The hallway had begun to fill. Nurses from the morning shift, a physiotherapist who had stopped midway through unlocking her cart, 2 veterans from the adjacent ward who had wheeled themselves to the doorway to watch. None of them said anything. They didn't need to. Cahill turned to Simone then. It was the first time he had looked at her the way people look at someone they are genuinely afraid of, and he directed it like an accusation. "You told them," he said. "Her notes told you," Thibodeau said quietly. You didn't read them. Rousseau stepped past Cahill. Dr. Cahill, you are removed from Corporal Tanner's case pending a full investigation. D&D will be requesting your medication access records for the past 6 months. Fontaine opened his mouth, closed it again. Simone turned toward Joel's room. The surgery lasted 4 hours and 23 minutes. Dr. Mehta worked the decompression with steady hands while Simone stood at the periphery of the operating room. Re-credentialed in the space of 40 minutes by an administrator who had clearly decided that losing one surgeon's cooperation was worse than explaining a paperwork anomaly. Simone did not touch the sterile field. She watched the monitors, called out positioning corrections when the numbers moved in the wrong direction, and said nothing when saying nothing was useful. At one point, the bleeding worsened and the anesthesiologist called the pressure. 68 systolic and dropping. And Simone said Trendelenburg 10 degrees and draw calcium. And when no one moved immediately, she said it again the same way she had said things in a Hercules cargo bay over the Sahel. Her patient's oxygen saturation heading south, and the loadmaster staring at her like she wasn't supposed to be there either. They moved. The pressure climbed. When it was over, Mehta looked across the table. You would have made a good surgeon, she said. I was better at the part before surgery, Simone said. Which part was that? The part where you jump out of the plane to get to them. Mehta was quiet for a moment, then SAR attachment. Simone said nothing. Thibodeau, standing outside the theater glass, gave the faintest nod of confirmation. The sedation records arrived by late afternoon. Pharmacy flagged 9 instances over 3 months, in which a sedative had been administered to Joel with no corresponding physician order and no nursing note. Ward camera footage showed Cahill entering room 7 at 2:14 a.m. on 3 separate occasions, alone each time, departing quickly. Military police met Cahill in his office at 4:47 p.m. He was cooperative in the way people are cooperative when they have already decided what they're willing to admit, and are hoping that will be enough. It was not enough. The research sponsor, Nexogen Neuro, a defense technology firm with a neural mapping program that required documented permanent cases with strong military profiles, lost its federal contracts within the week and was under separate investigation before the month was out. Simone was standing at Joel's ICU bed when she heard about Cahill. A constable she didn't know knocked on the glass and told her he had been taken for formal questioning. She nodded. She turned back to Joel. It's done, she said. The part where nobody believes us, that part's done. His left finger moved. The first time his hand had produced anything intentional in 6 months. A twitch, barely perceptible, the smallest possible assertion of a self that had been in there the entire time. Simone placed her own hand beside his without speaking. Outside, Ottawa continued in the gray November way it always did, indifferent and steady, and in room 7 of the Rideau Veterans Neurological Center, a man who had been buried alive by a prognosis began very slowly to come back. 6 weeks after surgery, Joel Tanner spoke a full sentence. It came out slowly, each word assembled with the concentration of someone rebuilding something from components they had almost forgotten how to use. The speech therapist, Odette, leaned close to catch it. Not finished, Joel said. Dr. Mehta, standing in the doorway with a coffee that had gone cold, heard it and did not attempt to say anything clinical. Simone was in the hallway. She heard it through the gap in the door. She had been carrying Shane Beaumont's name for 6 years, carrying the certainty that leaving his side was a failure she could never account for, that the space between reaching him and the moment he died had been hers to fill and hers to lose. Joel had spent 6 months unable to tell her that Shane had died talking about her, about the woman who had come out of Sahel dust with a rescue kit and a call sign that meant crow in French, and who had kept him alive long enough to matter. She saved him first. Thibodeau had brought her old Parasexcu patch with him from her service file, slid it across the nurse's station counter without ceremony, the way he did everything, and Simone pinned it inside her locker, beside a handwritten copy of Shane's last message from the field record, and a whiteboard on which she had written 2 words on the first Monday after the surgery. Not finished. Rideau Veterans Neurological Center changed its protocols within the month. Every patient classified as vegetative or minimally conscious was now required to receive a standardized communication assessment before any prognosis was recorded as final. The protocol was developed in collaboration with D&D, the Veterans Affairs portfolio, and a clinical working group that Simone was asked to lead. She still wore the same cobalt blue scrubs. She did not, for the record, describe herself as a hero. She described herself as someone who had learned, in conditions most people never encountered, that silence was not the same as absence, that a person could be completely present and completely invisible at once, and that the job of everyone around them was to look harder, not to look away. Cahill lost his license. The investigation took 8 months and reached further than anyone in the building had expected. Several other patients in his care were reviewed. 3 families received answers they had been waiting years for. None of it was called justice. Justice would have meant none of it happened. They called it accountability, a colder word that meant something had finally been made to stop. Joel walked to the end of the rehabilitation corridor on a Tuesday morning in March, 6 months after surgery, with his wife Lynn beside him and Simone waiting at the far end in bright blue scrubs. He was not steady, he was not fast. Every step was a negotiation between what his body remembered and what his brain was slowly, painstakingly relearning. He made it to the end. He looked at Simone, she looked at him. "Corby," he said. "Tangent," she said back. Lynn wiped her eyes with the sleeve of her jacket and did not ask what it meant. She had understood, somewhere in the past 6 weeks, that some things passed between people and languages formed in the dark, in dust, in the precise and terrifying vocabulary of survival, and that those languages were not meant to be translated, only carried. Simone stood in the corridor where the fluorescent lights buzzed, and the March light came through the windows thin and new, and thought about Shane, and about the road outside Cadal, and about 6 years of believing she had left someone behind. She had not left him behind. She had done what she was trained to do. She had done what the next person needed. That was not abandonment. It had always been the only honest definition of the work. She never promised her patients they would walk. She promised she would not stop looking at them until they were ready to find out for themselves. Standing there in Ottawa in March with a soldier at the end of a hallway proving everyone wrong, she thought that had always been enough, and that it always would be.